Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this CSP Indirect provider call as part of our quarterly incentives webinars. This is Richard Wills, the Partner Incentives Lead for Microsoft here in the UK. I'm just going to give one additional minute or a minute and a half or so, just in case there are any late people, and then we'll get straight into the content. Thank you very much. Okay, it looks like we've got a good level of attendance, so I'm going to get into the content, conscious that I potentially sit between you and your weekend. But before I go into the incentives related content, firstly, let me give an apology. I think many of you who attempted to join the call for the last quarter at the beginning of July, when you joined the link and the link provided, it took you to a different call to recording the indirect reseller call. So please let me apologise to anyone who was on that call. Hopefully you were still able to access the right information. I certainly continued the call even without attendees to provide that recording and the content, but my apologies, it's the only time that we've experienced that in all the time that we've put together these incentive webinars. So I hope that wasn't a great impact to you. In terms of the call today, just a note for anyone, particularly those who are new to this incentives webinar series, which we run on a quarterly basis. The idea behind this really is just to give you as value partners a touch point and to make sure that you are up to speed with all of the recent incentives changes, that you're aware of what the earning opportunity is and the way the program works. And ultimately what we want you to be able to do is to optimize our programs to get as much investment back into your business as possible, and of course to hope that that drives aligned business growth with Microsoft as well. But we tend to keep it high level. The key thing probably that gives you the opportunity to do in these calls is not only get clarity on what that program looks like or any additional campaigns relating to the programs themselves, but also to ask questions. So please do use the Q&A as we go through this call. I will pause intermittently and check that Q&A, and I'll do my best to answer those questions. I will physically read them out and then I'll answer those questions. So if you have a question that you want to keep private, please put that in the first part of the question, and what I'll try and do is at the end of the call is respond to that privately by writing the answer rather than calling it out. If you've got a question that you think is silly or stupid, then please do still ask that question. There will guaranteed be other people answering and thinking the same question in the call. I want to make sure you come out of this time with a really clear view of what the incentive programs look like. And although we have the hour scheduled, hopefully I'll do my best to clear the content in the quickest possible time without losing any of the thoroughness of the coverage, and that will enable you to get quicker to your weekend. So with that, let me go into the content itself. And the first thing to say probably is that, as you'll see from the bottom left-hand side of this first slide, we've actually changed the cadence of our program years. So historically, the CSP Indirect Provider Program alongside the other CSP incentive programs ran from the 1st of July to the 30th of June. When we got to the 30th of June 2020, what we effectively did is extend the program out for another 3 months, and then we have effectively refreshed it today, and the changes that you see today will be in market for another 12 months, all the way through to the 30th of September 2021. So that's the first thing to call out, and hopefully will give you some confidence around seeing rates that will be in market for a 12-month period, and really help you understand the investment you're going to see and how you best use that investment. Now, in terms of the CSP Indirect Provider Program, there are two sides to this. The left-hand side here is the mechanics around eligibility and how you sign up. From last reference, all of our indirect providers here in the UK are already signed up to the program, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time focusing on that side of it. It's relatively straightforward, but where I will put the time is on the right-hand side and just talking through the incentive rates. There is actually very little change year on year. and which is a positive. So from the 30th of September to effectively yesterday, the 1st of October, and the refresh of that programme year, there isn't a huge amount of change. And so let's take that piece by piece. Core incentives for Azure Build revenue continue to be at 4%. The piece to call out on that is that if you have started to create or move subscriptions to the new commerce experience, which we want you to do, the rate that we are paying there is 4%, so it is the same, and there is parity between the two programs. The only difference to call out is that at this current time, if you have a subscription that's set up on the new commerce experience rather than the legacy CSP platform, it will therefore be paid under the Microsoft Commerce Incentives program, which is slightly different. It will also be paid 100% rebate rather than 60-40% as the incentives are split under this program. So that may be a consideration for you, but we do want people to move customers over to the new commerce experience at the right time for the customer and the partner. The second line there for modern work and security, so thinking about our Office 365 and M365 products primarily, that incentive rate, again, I believe is consistent with the Q1 period of FY21, so July through to September, and is at 5%. And then the core rate for business applications is one of the rates that has changed and reduced. This is something that we called out during those July webinars and have tried to communicate and set the right expectation around. That's gone from 6% to 4.75%. That isn't necessarily reflective of a decrease in investments in business applications all up. What you'll see in a short while is actually that money has been invested in some of the product accelerators to focus on specific products. So if we move on then to talk about the global strategic product accelerators. So in the past, we just had a single lever under this line. And if you think about the products that were eligible in our FY20 period, we effectively had M365 SKUs all the way down to Office 365 Business Premium. We also have Business Central in there as well, and they were accruing an additional 5%. What's happened in this year is that that's been split out into two different tiers. And those two tiers have different product sets relating to each. For the Global Strategic Product Accelerator Tier 1, which is the top line of those paying an incremental 5% to your incentive rates, that covers M365 all the way from A5 to E3 to Business Premium. It does not include M365 Business Standard, nor does it include any of the Office 365 SKUs either. So just to be really clear on what's included in that tier at 5%. And that also includes Dynamics 365 Business Central, as it did do in our FY20 period. On the second line there, the Global Strategic Product Accelerator for Tier 2, that's paid at a higher rate, that's the 10% rate, and again, that is cumulative to the core incentives that you would receive. There are two primary sets of products included there. The first one is Dynamics 365 Sales Pro, and the second one is Power Apps. So both of those sets of products are included in that second tier, and they will pay either at 10%, or indeed at tier 1 at 5%. And therefore important to consider, of course, if you think about an M365 scenario, what that tier 1 effectively does is double the incentives. It adds another 5% to the existing core 5% rate. From a subscription software perspective, those rates again have remained consistent, and although keeping the rates as they were might not feel emotionally like a positive message, when we think about the growth of the CSP business at the rates we're paying, this provides a big investment and it shows how invested we are in CSP. So to keep these rates consistent with not only what they were in Q1 of this fiscal year, but also with the second half of our FY20 period is a really, really positive sign. And for subscription software, there are two applicable rates depending on the product that relates to it, either at 2.5% or at 6%. And then finally, two additional pieces. So as Azure reserved consumption, so think of this as reserved instances. Again, that 5% rate is consistent with what it was previously. And that pays on the consumption of those Azure reserved instances, not on the first off billing of those instances. That's really important to remember, and pays at a 5% rate. And finally, on the Microsoft Commercial Marketplace offers, so again, this has been in market now for over a year. We haven't seen as much traction as we like to on this one, but hopefully that will start to grow and increase. There are around about 160 different offerings on Marketplace that partners can procure, and we pay 10% as an incentive rate on those billings as well. Now, those two final rates are 100% rebate. So all of that comes through on that monthly payment as cash. For the remainder of the levers, the core levers, the global strategic product levers, and subscription software, that is all split 60-40 rebate and co-op. So that split remains the same, and the process remains the same as it has done in the past. And of course, as CSP indirect providers, most of you, I believe, will be reasonably comfortable with the process surrounding that of going through a half of earnings and then effectively executing on those earnings during the following 6-month period and making your claims against that pot of funding. One key thing to call out, and there have been questions on this, is whether or not, in line with what happened in H2 FY20, with obviously the impact of COVID on partners' ability to actually go out and execute on certain activities, not least where they're face-to-face activities that are being organised. At this point in time, I haven't had any guidance to say that the same principle or policy will be applied and unclaimed amounts will be paid as rebate. That's not to say that we won't see any kind of communication depending on where we get to through the rest of this fiscal half all the way up to end of December. But my message would be that wherever possible and where you have plans that you can execute on, please do accelerate the execution of those plans. Please make sure you get the claims in so you can get the money back on them. But at this point in time, be very, very cautious about potentially having unclaimed money that you could lose at the end of the half if a policy decision isn't made to that effect. So at this point, I'm just going to pause for a second and I'll go to the questions, see what's coming through before we move on to the next slide. So there's a question here around the timeline to move all the Azure subscriptions to Azure New Customer Experience. And particular reference here, and it's a good one to call out, which is the fact that previously there was a 2% incentive to effectively speed up the migration. And as the participant and attendee rightly points out, there is a lot of work to do, partners and subscriptions. So to my knowledge, there's not necessarily a timeline in terms of a deadline by which you must move those subscriptions over. And I think it's well understood that it's easier said than done. As I alluded to before, the 2% has gone, but the piece that I did allude to, of course, is that at this point in time, the incentives flowing from a Microsoft Commerce incentives program perspective, that MCI program, are 100% rebates. There is a slight advantage potentially if you'd like to see more of that money as rebate, but there is there's no 2% accelerator as there had been previously. Again, my understanding is that the new commerce experience offers a lot of advantages in terms of how you're able to manage those subscriptions, and they'll be of benefit to both the customer and the partner. But of course, we appreciate that it's not as simple as to simply switch them over from one to the other. But to my knowledge, I've not been aware of any timelines in terms of when that must happen. What I don't know at the moment also is whether or not there will be changes to incentives in the future that would obviously motivate partners to accelerate the speed of moving those agreements from one through to the other. Question here, are partner admin link incentives additive to indirect provider Azure Core or MCI? So think of these as working very, very differently. So partner admin link incentives through the MCI program would be in scenarios typically where the customer has an EA, or indeed where the customer has a Microsoft customer agreement and therefore it's not transacted via partner. So they would not be relevant from a CSP standpoint. Is the 10% global accelerator for Sales Pro applicable to the Business Central attached SKU? Good question. And the one thing I would signpost you to is that there is a full product addendum. I don't know it off by heart because it's down literally to SKU level, which I suspect many of you from an operations perspective will like because it's much better than it has been previously. In that product addendum, it will break down into effectively 3 separate tabs covering the Azure Modern Working Security and Business Applications areas or solution areas of the business. On each of those tabs, there is a full list of SKUs, and for each of them, it will tell you exactly which of the levers that product is eligible for, and then you can understand whether it's core plus global strategic product accelerator, or indeed any others that apply to it. And so that's the best way to do it, and that's available through MPN along with the incentive guide and the other assets, including the co-op guidebook. They're all in there together, so I would encourage you to access that and determine whether or not that specific attached SKU is relevant. I apologize, I don't know that SKU off by heart, so I don't want to say yes or no without referring back to that list. Do software subscription rates include perpetual licenses on CSP as well? So my understanding is yes, those are included within that subscription software piece. Again, the document I would refer you to is the product addendum, which will include and confirm which products and SKUs are included within that subscription software incentive lever, paying that 2.5% and 6%. So I think it's probably just a bit of feedback coming through just in terms of the challenge around commercial marketplace and the I guess the commercials of this and the ability to offer margin. So I do understand that it's going to make it difficult. I think the point is that from an indirect reseller perspective, it's going to be difficult. Obviously, for you as a CSP indirect provider, you need to make your decision on how you want to address that opportunity. As I alluded to earlier in the call, we've seen relatively low earnings on that particular lever, so we haven't had the high uptake. And I'm sure there are a number of commercial reasons as to why that's the case. Obviously, from perhaps a selfish personal perspective, want to make sure is that you're aware of that opportunity and that where you are able to sell those third-party apps through marketplace, that you're optimizing the incentives opportunity. Okay, with that, I'm just going to move on one slide and include what is a currently proposed campaign, but we're hopeful that it's something that will effectively come into market. And if it does come into market, the likelihood is it will happen very quickly and it will be backdated to the 1st of October. And for those who were aware of it, there was some conversation during the last 3 months around changes to be made on whether or not we could introduce additional incentives for non-profit. The goal initially was to try and include those as part of the global program, so it would have been covered by the previous slide, but from an engineering perspective, it's not been possible to amend that program, and therefore what we're looking to do at a global level is launch a campaign to enable partners to access greater incentives for non-profit SKUs, understanding the difficulty and the challenges there around margin and the price that indirect resellers ultimately are able to charge to customers. So this is the structure of it. What I've done here is the campaign itself is also intended to address the M365 business standard opportunity in emerging markets, of which the UK is not one. So please ignore only the M365 elements, but focus purely on the non-profit part. So you see on the top right hand side there, what it would effectively come down to as currently proposed is 6 different SKUs across Microsoft 365, E3, E5, Business Standard and Business Premium, and also Office E3 and E5. You can see the part numbers included there. What we would see is an additional incentive rate of either 15 or 20% in relation to those SKUs to essentially add more incentive into those non-profit SKUs and perhaps potentially to take some of the pressure away from the commercials of making that work. On the left-hand side, I would refer you to the revenue thresholds, and this campaign, just to be clear, is for indirect providers. It will also run for direct bill partners. It will not run for indirect resellers. It will be you as the indirect providers who receive the additional incentives on this campaign. And you'll see there that for the TSI non-profit element, the threshold is $30,000. What that effectively says is any partner who has transacted over $30,000 of revenue relating to these specific SKUs during the FY20 period would be eligible for this campaign. You would therefore receive the terms and conditions and be automatically enrolled in it, and you would receive those 15 and 20% incremental incentives as part of the campaign. So again, not the perfect world in terms of being able to include it as a specific lever in the program itself, but what you'll see from the program term on the bottom left hand side is that this does run for a 12-month period alongside the program term, and therefore the two things will align together. The only challenge, of course, is that the earnings you see will be paid on a periodic basis as a wire transfer as part of a campaign, rather than you being able to access and view them alongside your other program earnings in Partner Center. So I wanted to call that out. As I say, that's effectively a reaction to the feedback and the commercial reality of non-profit, and trying to make that that business scenario work, of course, for indirect providers and indirect resellers in terms of that customer arrangement as well. So with that, I'll just go back and check if there are any additional questions coming through. And I think we are good from the time being. I'll briefly cover off now the program